Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and before I do anything else, I want to remind you to hit the subscribe button to see lots more interesting conversations to come. But on today's episode of Unplanned, we're going to jump into the topic that we've been avoiding up to this point because it's such a big one, it's such an important one, and that's the topic of housing. And to get us into that topic, we've got two amazing people joining us today. They both are friends of mine. They're both very active on the housing affordability side and also the housing production side, and they're advocates for housing. And let me go no further than to just introduce them. First, I want to introduce Sean Hope, who is the president of Hope Real Estate, and he's also the acting president of the Massachusetts Housing Coalition. Sean, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me on Unplanned.
And let me, before you go on, let me introduce our second guest, who is Jesse Kanson-Benanav. And Jesse and I served on a board together here in Cambridge. He is a senior project manager at B'nai B'rith Housing, and he's also the founder of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Jesse, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you, Sam. It's good to be here with you and with Sean.
All right, so Sean, why don't we start with you? Well, both you guys, but Sean, I'll throw this question to you. You're deep in the you're both deep in the housing world. What are some of the? Let's start with some of the projects you're both working on, and we'll do a quick round here. Sean, what are some things you're working on right now?
Sure. So I'll start from the top. So I'm working on a 100% affordable housing development. This is currently in permitting at 2072 Mass Ave. It's an exciting project, and it is a 49-unit project with 3 accessible parking spaces. I think it's pretty quintessential smart growth development. It's within that quarter mile of transit, and the focus really it's on a main thoroughfare on Mass Ave near Porter Square. And it is servicing those that are in deep affordability. So not to get into the weeds too much, but 30% of the AMI. And so these are folks that are in great need of housing. And with COVID and the housing crisis, and now with whatever financial downturn, which we know is coming, this is one of those projects that I feel like I wish we started a year ago, but we are now in permitting. And then second project, which is only about a little further than a quarter mile, is Frost Terrace. And this is a project that was permitted and approved, permitted by Cambridge, funded by DHCD, and is now 60% under construction. And again, those are 40 units of housing, mostly 30% AMI. There's some projects, Section 8 vouchers, but again, family housing, 65% 2 and 3 bedrooms. And I kind of see these as companion projects because these speak to the city of Cambridge's commitment to affordable housing on pretty challenging sites, but also, in terms of all the demographics close to all the services that family needs, they check all the boxes. So, transit-oriented development is a big piece of these, but also they both sparked real community conversations. You're in a very
Sean, let's pause it there. We're going to hold that thought, if that's okay. Jesse, why don't you give us just a quick rundown of a project or two you're working on right now, just so we can get a flavor of some of the things you're working on.
Yeah, sure. So, wearing my B'nai B'rith Housing hat, we're an affordable housing developer, a nonprofit affordable housing developer. We work in Boston and the Boston suburbs. So, we just completed construction and are moving folks into our most recent tax credit development, which is the second phase of an existing development we have out in Sudbury, Massachusetts, out Metro West. So this is just outside of the sort of downtown Sudbury area. This is 56 units of housing for seniors and older adults, age 55 plus, for income levels, as high as 60% area median income, down to some of those, low AMIs, 30% AMI, as Sean mentioned. So that's 56 units on top of the 64 units that we built there about 6 years ago, bringing that campus in Sudbury, which didn't have really any multifamily housing or any substantial affordable housing beyond a couple senior public housing developments before we started this project. So bringing that up to 120 units. We at B'nai B'rith have a couple other projects in the works. We're under construction in a 38 units adaptive reuse and new addition to an old school in Swampscott, right outside of right near the Swampscott train station, near the Swampscott High School and Senior Center. That's also housing for older adults. And just last year, I helped permit our first family development in the city of Boston, which will be in West Roxbury. It's permitted by the Boston Planning Development Agency. It's has a funding allocation from the city of Boston and will be in the next DHCD funding round for a tax credit award. So that's going to be 60 units of affordable and workforce family housing, the first private affordable housing in West Roxbury really ever, besides some senior public housing.
All right, Jesse, we're going to come back to that, but now I'm going to enlist you to help me ask Sean questions about the project, Sean, you were talking about, and you were talking about the deep affordability at 30% AMI. And just for viewers who may not know AMI, it's area median income. And it's a metric that's used for many purposes, but for one purpose is to determine what counts as affordable, quote unquote, affordable in the region you live in. And it turns out, I actually looked it up right before we got on the air here. And for the Boston area, what the number I found for 2019 was $94,430 is the area median income. You guys might know that number better. If it's incorrect, please correct it. But Sean, why don't you take us back to your two projects on Massachusetts Avenue here in Cambridge, and what you're trying to achieve. You were starting to tell us about that and the needs, both the needs of the community, but also the fact that it's close to transit and the importance of doing that. And Jesse, you should feel free to chime in and ask questions or engage on this topic. But Sean, why don't you keep going with your thought there about your projects?
Yeah. So I think land in Cambridge is expensive. Land in the Commonwealth is expensive. But I think one of the challenging factors in terms of smart growth development, and I'm using that term not necessarily in the technical term, but in terms of being energy efficient, close to transit, close to places where people can use, don't have to rely on automobiles to be able to do some of the basic things they need to do, get to work, grocery stores and the like. So near transit, the land is exponentially more expensive. While a single family home in West Cambridge is also expensive, if you're going to build to scale, building near transit the land is even more expensive. So one of the great opportunities on both of these sites is that they both were available and we could make them pencil in terms of the scale and the amount of units. The challenging part, though, is, when you have near transit, part of the city council and Envision Cambridge, which was a planning process funded by the city, was to, be less reliant on automobiles. So in theory, that's great. But what happens is when you do a development of scale next to transit and you are not going to provide parking, people still have cars. And so what you end up having is you have this tension between people who in theory want to support affordable housing, but also you have things like parking spaces and street parking spaces that requires a trade-off and a sacrifice that oftentimes people don't want to make when it's them making this for people who are not yet here now. So both of these projects are going to have cars, and we are providing limited parking. And so one of the challenges with this smart growth development that is in line with all the planners is its impact on the communities. And so
Sean, I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to be jumping in from time to time.
Sure.
Jesse, I want you to pick up that thread of working in neighborhoods, because it's something we've all experienced, no matter how we approach this stuff, whether we're advocates or planners or developers. And you've had some experience addressing that. Why don't you pick up on Sean's notion of, we support affordable housing, and I don't want to get into a whole complicated discussion about it, but what's been your experience in that realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sean's hit it on the head. People in progressive communities like Cambridge, and since I'm not a Cambridgian anymore, and you two still are, I'll try to avoid bashing Cambridge too much. But Cambridge is a place that purports to hold these progressive values of being a welcoming community, being a sustainable environmental community. But often when the rubber hits the road, they don't want to make the tough choices that sort of force them to live up to those values, right? So, Sam, you and I both served for years on the board of A Better Cambridge, which was, the advocacy group that I co-founded back in 2012, and really that was the impetus for the founding of that organization. I lived in Cambridge for a number of years before I really got involved in these issues, but I was a planner, so I thought about these issues, and I just sort of felt like every time Cambridge anytime there was a new development, a mixed income, market rate, affordable development proposed anywhere in the city, although Cambridge purported to be this progressive, welcoming, sustainable community, when the rubber hit the road, there was always reasons that neighbors found to oppose it. And we've seen this even in recent years with, things from, environmental legislation that they want to impose on new developments that would make it nearly financially infeasible to do affordable housing. Everyone wants affordable housing, but they don't want to make it work. Or developments like Sean's with lower parking ratios. Reducing reliance on cars is one of the best things we can do to be sustainable. We talk about it in Vision Cambridge and other planning processes over the years. People don't want to do it. So, it's really tough. And it means that even progressive communities aren't living up to their full potential, and that's challenging, and it's something we see not just in Cambridge but all over the place.
All right, so I'm going to bounce it back to Sean now and just ask you, how does what Jesse's just been talking about sound to you? You were talking about building at scale, and I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what does it mean to build at scale. I assume you're not talking about building 3 units or 4 units. Building at scale is building a larger building than that, right? Trying to house more people than just that.
Yeah, and I think it's probably by neighborhood or by region or what scale means. But I think, for in urban sites, I think we're really talking about 20 units plus. I mean, even a 15-unit project is pretty dense. But what it's not is the 2 to 3 family, which you see throughout Cambridge, which was kind of built at a certain time. And so, being a Cantabrigian, watching it evolve, I am sensitive to the idea of there are certain building types that make you feel like home. And when things change, there is that tension. I think the challenge that I have, and selfishly so, these major thoroughfares are to me have evolved and need to evolve if we're going to be a competitive city. And when you have these major thoroughfares, there is a neighborhood behind that, and people kind of take ownership on their little walk from their neighborhood onto this major street. And I think that pride in ownership is great. But I think the tension is when you have goals like building affordable housing, housing equity, they run up against, the old Cambridge, the quaintness that you kind of liked. And I also think there's this generational shift, and I'm using broad terms, but I feel like in Cambridge, the baby boomers are really what I've called the landowners, right? They're the people who bought in the 70s and 80s, right? When Cambridge was more affordable. They're the people who show up to the council meetings and in many ways drive policy. And I'm in my 40s, I have small kids. And so I feel like I'm another wave, right? I've bought in the last 2-3 years. I see a very different future of Cambridge than maybe my mom, where I'm like, if I want to have more people who look like me, I want to have more people that I create, the Cambridge that I want to see, then I want more density. I want more scale. I want more artist loft. I want more of those things. And I will trade off more congestion for maybe some more interest. And so we really kind of have this crossroads. And the unfortunate thing about affordable housing is we are speaking for people who are not here, right? These are people who are coming, right?
Let's hold that thought. Jesse, you were agreeing with some of what Sean was saying. And then Jesse, just to let you know, I now want, after you give that thought, I want to take us out to the suburbs, because it sounds like you were doing some projects out in Sudbury, and it'd be interesting to hear about what that experience has been like. But you were agreeing with something Sean was saying, it sounded like.
Yeah, no, I agree with all the points that Sean made. I was just thinking, recently there was the question I think the city council in Cambridge is grappling with, even not even in terms of just, like future residents, but whether, there's a requirement to notify butters, and that's property owners of projects as they happen. But what about all those renters in a city like Cambridge that I believe is over 60% rental? There was a real question as to whether the city should actually be notifying renters, and it's not as easy because the owner isn't or the renter isn't necessarily listed on the deed like an owner is. But there was real pushback just to the very simple notion of making sure the entire community is notified of projects, so it's not just those relatively well-off longer-term homeowners that show up to help determine policy and development in the city.
All right, Jesse, take us out to the suburbs. I want to hear what this experience is like in a Sudbury or maybe even a West Roxbury. I don't know. What's been your experience with that?
Well, West Roxbury is an interesting one because West Roxbury is, of course, technically part of the city of Boston, but it looks and functions and believes very much that it is a suburb. They get the benefits of living in the city, but sort of maintain their lifestyle of, often, large lot, single family suburban way of living, like the suburbs. So that was an interesting challenge. West Roxbury is a community that has had, quite a bit of multifamily development, albeit not affordable, in recent years. Our project was slightly different because we purchased an already permitted development. It was supposed to be a 60-unit luxury condo development. So we didn't have to go through the full BPDA Article 80 process. That's the planning review process in the city of Boston, because that had already been done. Our permitting process was more compact. We just had to go through a process of notifying the neighbors and holding hearings to convert the use from a 60-unit condo project to a 60-unit affordable rental project. But even that was fraught. There's a real division in a place like West Roxbury between the old timers and a lot of the newer folks who are people that are maybe spilling in from places like and priced out of places like West Roxbury, Rosendale or Jamaica Plains. So maybe more progressive, pro-affordable housing folks competing with sort of an older mentality of this is a white Irish community, and building family affordable housing means different people will be living here. So it really, I would say, bordered on, if not got explicitly racist at times. But that's West Roxbury. That really is the city of Boston. Sudbury is different. That is a very suburban community. Like I said earlier on, before we built our first phase in 2014, there was no multifamily zoning. There's really just one multifamily district allowed by right or by special permit now in Sudbury. There really weren't many apartments that had ever been built. There was no scale affordable development. I wasn't around for the permitting of that phase, nor technically for the permitting of this phase, but I've been involved the last 2 years since I joined B'nai B'rith in a lot of the community outreach and funding process with the town.
All right, so you both have raised very interesting things, and Sean, you were talking about an urban corridor, and there's a fascinating thing here in Cambridge about the planning and the zoning around Mass Avenue, because there is this whole question of there's a part of the city that was old industrial, Kendall Square, and the idea that you would build taller buildings and new buildings there is less controversial than if you go back into the historic fabric of the city. But you're still in what we would call an urban core. And then, Jesse, you're talking about the suburbs and sort of the suburban reaction to the notion of higher density, more affordability. And you both have mentioned this generational divide between, say, an older set, whether it's in West Roxbury and the people who've lived there for forever, or in Cambridge, as kind of the baby boomers who themselves were progressives, but as time has gone on, maybe have become more reactive to things happening in their neighborhoods. I want you both to kind of switch gears slightly. You're both advocates and also policy people as well. Stepping back from your specific projects, what do you think are the policy what's the meaning of all this as it relates to housing in the Boston metro area? That's kind of the big push. The nub here is, how do we get enough housing at different income levels for enough people? Sean, why don't I start with you and just give us your sense of what does this all mean in kind of the bigger picture, the sort of 20,000-foot view of the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Thought a lot about it. There's been a lot written and talked about, so I don't know if I have anything necessarily new to add. But I think, like the traffic, it's I think housing and traffic feel a lot to me like it's a regional problem, right? So it's not like people who need housing are just in Cambridge, and it's not the people that are housed in Cambridge are going to also just stay and work in Cambridge. So it's almost like this: we need to live and to travel, but there are some consequences to that. And so I do feel that Cambridge, particular, because we have so many resources, and because we are so blessed with a biotech industry, right? A educational industry, right? All of which feeds our services, feeds our tax bases. As a property owner, feeds my rental income. So there's all these things that are happening in Cambridge. And so I do feel as part of the region, we have to do our fair share. And I think, each city and town, and this is what the policymakers decide. But in addition to that, what other obligation do we have? Right. And I feel like the same way I feel like too much is given, much is required. And I try to live that. I do believe as a city, we have that. We should do that. Now, there are also trade-offs. And if I'm a resident, how much of the burden should fall on me? And I think that is something that is real. But I think when you think about Cambridge, I was walking my dog at the dog park and I let him off the leash. There's nobody there. And there was a guy in a vehicle, an enforcement, who walked all the way across, and I saw him walking towards me. I picked up my leash, and he gave me, said, sir, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, they're paying somebody to sit there during a pandemic to watch if a person with a dog is off the leash. How much are they paying him to do that? And I just said to myself, we are such a rich city. We have a committee and a process for everything. So yeah, maybe we should be doing more than Drake it when it comes to affordable housing, right? Maybe we should do more than others. Lowell, where they're struggling with their school system and giving every kid a laptop. So yeah, we may have a greater burden, and that might have a greater burden on our population. But I do believe that we have the resources to do it. So I'm selfish. I'm an affordable housing developer, and I'm in it because I want the city to look more like I want it to look instead of what I feel like it's become. But I do think Cambridge has a greater responsibility because of what we've been blessed with. And I would say, yes, we've done some of that ourselves, but also it's just a product of, how things have developed. And that's kind of where I'm at on it.
Yeah, fascinating thoughts, and so much there, and hopefully we'll get a chance to get back to it. Jesse, I'm curious about your thoughts at the regional level. What your takeaways are from all of these specific projects, and then the broader issues. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, so let me go back real quick to Sudbury, because I want to make sure I was criticizing, but I don't mean to bash, because the town of Sudbury has been a critical partner with B'nai B'rith Housing and getting these two phases built. Over the years, we've had housing. They have an affordable housing trust that has put money in. We have CPA money. We had their allocation of home funds through this West Metro Collaborative. They've been really helpful and partners with us. A lot of people in town really care about affordable housing. And we're helping them reach their goals under the Massachusetts 40B law. There are people around the region, even in exclusive or exclusionary large lot suburbs, that want their towns to do more. One of the problems that we've had in Massachusetts over the years is that we're one of just a handful of states that requires city councils or town meeting or whatever authority to have supermajority to pass zoning changes, to upzone, to grant special permits, etc. The housing choice legislation, which has been pending in the legislature for years and may have been passed in the recent budget amendment. I'm actually a little unclear, but had more legs this year, would change that, particularly in cases of sustainable, smart growth development, affordable housing developments, and a few other circumstances. So you don't just need a super majority, you can do a simple majority. And this means that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did a study last year where they found a number of affordable and housing developments or rezonings that failed with still a majority of whatever town council had the authority over it. So the housing choice legislation will be critical in making sure that a variety of communities around the region step up and through a simple majority, can approve up zonings for multifamily, smart growth, and affordable housing and other circumstances.
Absolutely. And I want to take this opportunity just to thank you both. We could obviously talk about these issues for a long, long time. You brought up the issue of zoning reform here in Massachusetts, which is a very specific topic to Massachusetts, but very critical. When Jesse, I think you've heard this, but when I first became an urban planner, they were talking about zoning reform, and that's a long time ago now. So some of these processes take a really long time. The other thing that we didn't talk about, and maybe we can get back to it some other conversation, is we've talked a lot about affordable, but there's also the market rate side of this and the creation of units.
But I also think that the market rate component is important, because I do think, like ABC and abundant mass housing, housing, even if you don't qualify for affordable housing, there's a whole middle income tier of families that just are priced out. And, making sure that there's more housing in the certain areas that make a lot of sense to spur job densities in different areas. It shouldn't all be just in Boston, right? There are other centers, other places. So just want to say that MHC has really helped me think regionally and grow in that way. And I would love to talk more about it on your next Unplanned.
Absolutely. And that, just for everybody, that's the Massachusetts Housing Coalition. And I'll put up websites for all that. But yeah, maybe we can get you guys back on that side of it. With that,
it'd be fun to have us both back to talk about our similar organizations or how they're similar, how they're different. So hopefully we can do that sometime soon.
Yeah,
that'd be great. It's the holiday season. Wishing everybody happy holidays and a happy new year.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sam.